Does your hometown have its own urban legend? Maybe some forbidden lore that everyone knows but prefers to avoid bringing up? I can assure you that my story tops anything the internet could come up with. I'm from a small town with a population of roughly 1,500 people. For the sake of safety, I'll leave its name anonymous. Wouldn't want any thrill-seeking explorers heading here. You see, the town's infamous tale centers around an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese's, hidden away on the desolate north side of town. Before I was born, my town was briefly a bustling spot, but that all faded when the main factory shut down and most businesses relocated. Chuck E. Cheese's, along with other once successful franchises, couldn't survive the drop in foot traffic and eventually crumbled, leaving behind a dilapidated ruin. The rumors about the place all started when Johnny Cameron disappeared about 25 years ago. He was only 7 at the time. Supposedly, Johnny and his older brother Alex devised a plan to sneak out after their parents went to bed and bike down to the old Chuck E. Cheese's. They pulled off the plan smoothly. No one heard the boys leave, and they made it to Chuck E. Cheese's unnoticed. But after that, things get hazy. What we do know is that the Camerons woke up to empty beds the next morning. A search began, and Alex was found huddled outside the derelict Chuck E. Cheese's, repeatedly mumbling the same chilling phrase. Where a kid can be a kid, where a kid can be a kid, where a kid can be a kid. That's all he said since. They say he was sent to a psychiatric ward not long after. Rumor has it, he's still there. The police searched every corner of the place. All they found was one of Johnny's shoes, partially submerged in the ball pit. As years went by with no sign of Johnny, the Cameron family fell apart. Johnny's father, Brady Cameron, couldn't bear the loss and grief and took his own life a couple of years after the disappearance. Susan Cameron, with her family either dead, missing, or institutionalized, descended into alcoholism and drug use. She was often seen wandering the same parking lot where Alex had been found years before, muttering incoherently. About a decade after Johnny's disappearance, the police found her body in that very lot. She'd overdosed, and a toxicology report revealed a cocktail of drugs in her system. That's the official story, at least. Years of speculation, with no solid leads, have left the town clinging to an urban legend that still haunts us today. Many believe something evil resides in that Chuck E. Cheese's, lurking among the dust-covered arcade games. I can tell you firsthand, they're right. Around here, it's known as the Cameron Curse. The legend says anyone who enters that building will suffer a fate worse than death, and their loved ones will endure endless torment. I've always been skeptical of that sort of thing. I never believed in ghosts or those silly, don't do this at 3 a.m. videos on YouTube. In fact, I took pride in debunking myths. That's how I ended up in my current predicament. I was 12 when it happened. I was with my best friends, Jack and Henry, and we were doing our usual summer routine, wandering around town, since there wasn't much else to do. Dude, get off your phone before you walk into something. Jack snapped at Henry as he barely dodged a collision. Who are you texting anyway? You've been glued to that thing all night. I teased as Henry shoved his phone back into his pocket. Sorry, guys. You know Jessica, the girl I was telling you about? I got her number right before school let out. We've been talking a lot, Henry said, his cheeks flushing. That's awesome, man. Jessica's really cute. Have you two made any plans to hang out yet? I asked, genuinely happy for him. Henry wasn't exactly the outgoing type, so it was great to see him hitting it off with someone. Not yet, but I think I'm going to ask her to go to Ford Lake with me next week, he replied, excitement creeping into his voice. I really think she Henry's words were abruptly cut off as Jack rudely interrupted him. No way you're talking to Jessica, man. She's way out of your league. Bet you're texting your mommy instead. Aw, does baby need his blankie? Jack taunted, a smug grin spreading across his face. That look said it all. Jack knew exactly how to push Henry's buttons, and he took full advantage of it every chance he got. Stirring up trouble was practically a sport for him. Shut the hell up, you jerk. You're just mad because she's not into you. Henry shot back, his voice cracking as tears began to well up in his eyes. I could get her number if I wanted to, bro. I just don't feel... Jack stopped mid-sentence when he noticed that I had come to a complete stop, my gaze fixed across the street. Cole, hurry up, he called out to me. I didn't answer. Jack and Henry, momentarily forgetting their argument, followed my line of sight. The color drained from their faces when they realized what I was staring at: the abandoned Chuck E. Cheeses. A heavy tension filled the air, thick and suffocating. At first, I couldn't quite place what I was feeling, but then it hit me. Fear. We stood frozen in silence, staring at the decaying building for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Henry broke the stillness. "How did we even walk this far? It feels like we've only been out here for a few minutes," he stammered, his voice shaky. "I don't know, but we should probably head back," I murmured, still in a daze. Just as we turned to leave, Jack pointed ahead and shouted, "Cops!" Sure enough, a police cruiser was slowly making its way down the road, heading right for us. "Come on, this way!" I yelled, and without hesitation, we broke into a sprint. It was well past curfew, and the last thing any of us wanted was to get caught. The thought of the punishment we'd face at home drove us to run faster. Before I even realized it, we were huddled behind the very building we had been staring at just moments ago, gasping for air. "Think they're gone?" Henry panted, clutching his chest as he tried to catch his breath. "I'm not sure. I'll check," I replied, struggling to speak between gulps of air. My heart was racing, my lungs burning from the exertion. As I cautiously stepped forward to peek around the corner, blue lights lit up the area, signaling our answer. Suddenly, a gravelly voice echoed through a megaphone. "Boys, come out with your hands up. I know you're back there." It was Officer Jenkins. Out of the few officers in our small town, he was the one I dreaded most. If he recognized us, he'd definitely run straight to our parents. "What now?" Henry whispered, his voice laced with panic. "Well, I don't know about you, but I'd rather not get grounded for a month," Jack muttered, nodding toward an employee entrance just a few feet away. The faded employees only sign was barely clinging to the old rusted purple door. "Yeah, I'm with Jack. If Jenkins catches us, he'll probably spin some crazy story about us vandalizing the place," I agreed. "But what about the curse?" Henry blurted out, eyes widening with dread. Right on cue, Jenkins' voice rang out again, more impatient this time. "Don't make me come back there." That was all Henry needed to hear. We scrambled toward the door, practically tripping over each other in our haste. Strangely, the employee entrance was already slightly open, but we didn't have time to dwell on it. We rushed inside, and Jack quickly locked the door behind us. As the panic subsided and our eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, we took in our surroundings. "It's a break room," Henry squeaked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was right. The room hadn't been touched in years. A faint light from a small window near the exit cast eerie shadows across the space. To our right, two foldable tables sat covered in a thick layer of dust, accompanied by several filthy chairs. In the corner, an old tube TV jutted out from the wall, its flimsy plastic arm barely holding it in place. To the left of the TV was a grimy refrigerator, a pool of some unidentifiable brown liquid oozing out from underneath it. Next to the fridge was a rusty sink, its water-stained surface reflecting the faint moonlight. Along the left wall stood a row of battered purple lockers, casting long, ominous shadows in the dimly lit room. We hadn't even processed where we were when Jenkins's muffled voice echoed outside, spurring us into action. "We should hide, just in case Jenkins manages to get in," I whispered, pointing toward a door on the opposite side of the room. Jack and Henry nodded, though I could see the fear etched on their faces. Their wide eyes gave them away, and I noticed Henry trembling slightly as we made our way toward the door. As we passed by the refrigerator, the stench of rotting food hit us, forcing us to quicken our pace, desperate to get away from the smell and the unsettling place we found ourselves in. I slowly pushed open the door to the break room, a creeping sense of dread crawling up my spine as we peered into the massive, dimly lit room. The space stretched out before us, far larger than I expected. Squinting, I could make out the ticket booth near the front, with dusty, forgotten stuffed animals behind the counter, still waiting for a child to claim them. The arcade machines, silent and long dead, were scattered across the room, relics of a time when the place buzzed with life. To our right, a row of 8 metal picnic tables lined the dining area, their surfaces cluttered with old pizza boxes that looked like they had been left behind in a hurry. Beyond the dining area, the children's play zone loomed, a jungle of brightly colored plastic tubes culminating in a long, purple slide that led directly into the ball pit. I couldn't help but shudder at the thought of Johnny Cameron's shoe lying somewhere in that pit of brightly colored balls. A heavy unease settled over me, and I couldn't shake the disturbing sensation that we were being watched. My head snapped to the right, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. There, against the back wall, was a stage I had somehow missed during my first glance. Atop it stood 3 animatronics, their presence grotesquely unsettling. They looked like something ripped straight out of a nightmare, almost like the characters from Five Nights at Freddy's. Their heads were cocked to the side, gazing, no, glaring directly at us. Cold, hateful eyes seemed to bore into my soul. The one nearest to us, a mustachioed chef with a menacing scowl, looked downright furious, as if we had just trespassed on some forbidden ground. "Holy shit," I muttered, barely able to breathe. Let's keep moving," Jack whispered, his voice shaking with fear. We cautiously navigated the rows of ancient arcade machines, their darkened screens reflecting the faintest glimmer of moonlight. As we reached the front of the store, Henry suddenly put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. "Hide," he barely whispered, his voice almost too quiet to hear. Without hesitation, we scattered, ducking behind nearby arcade cabinets. From my hiding spot, I could see both Henry and Jack, their faces drained of color. Henry was staring at the employee restroom near the ticket booth, frozen in terror. The door creaked open slowly. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands shook violently, cold sweat dripping down my forehead. Whatever was coming out of that door, I wasn't ready. In the dim light, it was hard to make out at first. But then, as a shaft of moonlight caught it, I saw it. Standing before us was a grotesque rat, as tall as a grown man. At least 6 feet, it stood on its hind legs, its yellow eyes wild with hunger, the left one twitching sporadically. Its matted gray fur was patchy, with bald spots exposing its raw pink skin. Awkward, crooked orange teeth jutted from its gaping mouth, and a long pink tail swayed behind it. The sight of it was horrifying enough, but what made my blood run cold was the t-shirt it wore. A too-tight, faded purple shirt with the Chuck E. Cheese logo stretched across its chest. A horrifying realization crashed over me. This was Chuck E. Cheese. In the flesh. Or what was left of it. My shock was interrupted by frantic movement out of the corner of my eye. Jack was waving his arms, desperately trying to get our attention. Both Henry and I turned our focus to him. He mouthed something, and we strained to make out his words. "Run on the count of 3. Henry nodded, though fear was etched all over his face. "Where?" I mouthed back silently. Jack pointed toward the play area, far in the corner. I glanced at it briefly before looking back at him. Meanwhile, Chucky's nose was twitching, sniffing the air as if it were hunting. We had no time left. Jack held up 3 fingers. 1. My heart felt like it was about to explode from my chest. Time seemed to slow, every second stretching out. 2. The fear in Jack's eyes was unmistakable now. His confidence had wavered, and I could see panic spreading across his face. 3. We bolted. I tore forward with Jack and Henry on either side, zigzagging through the maze of arcade machines. Behind us, I heard the terrifying skittering sound of claws scraping against the carpet. The giant rat was chasing us, closing in fast. Suddenly, every single arcade machine roared to life. Lights flickered on, and the room was filled with the jarring sounds of jingles and beeps from games long out of order. The sudden burst of color and noise nearly blinded me. Above us, a speaker crackled to life, playing a warped recording on a loop. "Chuck E. Cheese's, where a kid can be a kid," it sang mockingly, as if the building itself was in on the nightmare. There was something dark and menacing behind those words. With every repetition, the voice grew more twisted, more distorted, as if mocking us. I forced myself to stay focused, ignoring the chaotic noise erupting around us. We were so close, just a few more steps and we'd reach the play area. "Ah!" A scream tore through the air, followed by a sickening thud. It was Jack. I glanced back instinctively, but I couldn't stop running. Even now, I wish I hadn't looked. My heart sank, dread consuming me as I saw what was happening. Chuck E. had pounced on Jack, and the oversized rat was tearing into him. Jack's body convulsed, his face twisted in unbearable agony as Chuck E.'s claws ripped through his stomach, pulling out flesh with ravenous fury. Blood soaked the floor beneath him, pooling around the vermin's feet. "Keep running," Jack gasped, barely able to speak through gritted teeth, his voice broken and choked with pain. Chuck E.'s face was smeared with Jack's blood, its grotesque mouth gnashing as it devoured him. Jack kicked and flailed, but his efforts were futile against the monster. Our eyes met for one brief, heartbreaking moment, and in his gaze, I saw a desperate plea. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. My chest ached with sorrow, anger, and guilt. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, to help him. But deep down, I knew I had to keep going. Henry and I reached the entrance to the plastic tube jungle. Without hesitation, we dove in, crawling on all fours as fast as we could. The colorful tunnels twisted and turned, disorienting us, but we kept moving. Jack's screams echoed behind us, each agonizing cry cutting through me like a knife. Guilt weighed heavy on my chest with every tortured sound. His screams grew fainter as we crawled, then eventually fell silent. By the time we stopped, I was sobbing uncontrollably, my breath ragged and my body shaking with grief. Henry grabbed my shoulder and spun me around to face him. "Jack, blood, dead," I stammered through the tears, barely able to form words. "Cole, listen to me," Henry said, his voice firm and steady despite the terror in his eyes. "We can mourn later. Right now we have to make it out of here. Jack would want that. We have to be brave, okay?" His words hit me like a lifeline and I nodded, wiping the tears from my face. "Yeah, you're right," I replied, though my voice still trembled. A flicker of determination began to stir inside me. We had to survive. For Jack. We sat still for a few moments, listening. The arcade machines were still blaring their deafening racket, and that distorted voice continued its hellish chant. "Chuck E. Cheese's, where a kid can be a kid." Over and over, it repeated, each time sounding more demonic than before. The dread gnawed at me, but I forced myself to push it aside. "Cole, I need you to promise me something," Henry said softly, his eyes avoiding mine. "What is it?" I asked, unsure where this was going. "If I don't make it out..." His voice trailed off, and for a moment he looked lost in thought. "Don't talk like that," I snapped, grabbing his arm to force him to meet my eyes. "We will make it out of here." "I know," he said, though his tone betrayed the fear he was trying to suppress. "But if something happens to me, tell my mom I love her." A single tear rolled down his cheek as he said it. "That's not going to..." "Promise me, Cole." His eyes locked onto mine, filled with determination. I knew I couldn't argue. "I promise," I whispered, my voice heavy with reluctance. A tense silence fell over us, but it was soon shattered by a loud clunk from somewhere beneath us. "Shit. It knows we're in here," Henry hissed. "We have to move. Find the way out." He didn't have to say it twice. We scrambled forward, crawling as fast as we could through the maze of plastic tubes. My knees throbbed, and my palms stung from the constant friction. But I didn't slow down. The skittering of claws echoed behind us, growing louder, too close for comfort. I took a sharp right, dead end. I turned left, another dead end. Panic surged as I forced myself to keep moving forward. Finally, I saw it. The exit. Bright light spilled through the opening at the end of the tunnel. My body screamed in protest as I pushed myself harder, desperate to reach it before Chuck E. caught up. The final tube sloped downward into the ball pit. I threw myself headfirst into the sea of plastic balls, Henry close behind me. I swam through the colorful orbs, struggling to reach the edge. When I finally dragged myself out, I turned to help Henry, but he wasn't there. My heart raced, confusion flooding my mind. He had been right behind me. He had to be there. A rustling from within the ball pit made me freeze. "Henry?" I whimpered, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. I stood motionless, dread rooting me to the spot as I watched the balls shift and stir. The disturbance grew larger, rippling toward the surface. Then, everything went still. For a moment, I thought about calling out again, but before I could, there was a deafening boom. A surge of round plastic spheres burst into the air as Chucky's grotesque form emerged from the pit, his lower half still obscured from view. His yellowed teeth snapped together, and fresh blood dripped from his mouth, staining his ragged t-shirt with a dark crimson. He locked his wild yellow eyes onto me, their intensity sharp enough to pierce through my skull. Behind those crazed eyes, I could sense something primal: hunger. A ravenous, animalistic hunger, like a starved predator. And I was the next prey. Without warning, Chucky plunged back beneath the surface, rocketing toward me as the plastic balls scattered in all directions. I seized the moment, sprinting toward the entrance where we had first entered that nightmare. Chucky's heavy, pounding footsteps trailed me just seconds after I bolted, while the eerie, hateful glares of the animatronic figures followed me every step of the way. I wasn't a believer, but I prayed to any deity willing to listen that I could make it out alive. The door was just ahead. His rancid breath was hot on the back of my neck as he rapidly closed the gap between us. With one final surge of energy, I slammed into the door, locking it behind me in a frenzy. A thunderous bang shook the door as I clicked the lock into place, followed immediately by another. I didn't stick around to see if it would hold. I sprinted toward the employee exit, throwing myself against it with all the strength I had left. Gasping for air and wheezing, I tumbled onto the warm asphalt, scraping my knees, but the pain didn't matter. A tidal wave of pent-up emotion crashed over me, and I broke down, sobbing, screaming, and crying out the names of my friends until my voice gave out. What felt like an eternity passed before I finally lifted my head. Officer Jenkins was standing over me, one hand resting on his belt, his face a mix of solemnity and sympathy. I could read the pity in his expression before he even spoke. The other two. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I shook my head slowly, my eyes welling with fresh tears that I struggled to keep from spilling over. Jenkins turned briefly, something wet hitting the ground with a soft plop. He turned back to me, offering a large, calloused hand. I reluctantly took it, and he hoisted me to my feet. With my head hanging low, I began walking toward his police cruiser, but Jenkins stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. "Cole, I'll explain everything to your parents. If anyone asks, you didn't see anything, all right?" I nodded in agreement. Jenkins stayed true to his word. He drove me home and explained the situation to my parents. Once he was gone, my mom pulled me into a tight embrace, and I cried like a helpless child. I knew then that my life would never be the same, not without my friends. The following weeks were some of the hardest I'd ever endured, with well-meaning neighbors offering their condolences. But no amount of "I'm sorry" could bring my friends back. The town hosted a memorial service for Henry and Jack. It was a heartfelt tribute, and I remember thinking they honored them well. I kept my promise to Henry. His mother was there, grieving alongside the rest of the town for her son. After most people had left, I gathered the courage to approach her, and she pulled me into a tight hug. She held me close for what seemed like forever, and I couldn't stop the tears from streaming down my face. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. I know you and Henry were best friends," she said, her voice hollow, her eyes sunken with grief. "Mrs. Abbott, Henry loves you," I managed to choke out between sobs. Her expression softened just a little, a brief flicker of light in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, before turning to leave. The events of that night have haunted me ever since. I miss Jack and Henry every day. I always will. Until now, I've never told anyone what really happened that night. I left town the moment I turned 18, and I've never looked back. Now I'm 27, married to the love of my life and expecting our first child in just 3 months. But strange tragedies have followed me ever since that night. My uncle lost an arm in a freak accident with a wood chipper. My father died in a car crash a couple of years ago. My cousin's house caught fire, leaving him without a home. For years, I tried to convince myself that these were just coincidences, random misfortunes. But I can't ignore the truth any longer. So why am I telling you all of this now? Why bring up these memories after all this time? Well, I'm currently in a car, making an 8-hour drive back to my hometown. I'm returning to that cursed place to finish what I should have done years ago, because yesterday, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. I can't stand by and let this take away the last good thing I have in this world. I don't know if it'll work, but I've got 10 gallons of gasoline and a book of matches. I'm going to burn that hellish place to the ground, and if that unnatural monster is still there, I'm going to make him suffer. Maybe then, I can finally get his sickening catchphrase out of my head.